He stared at the empty chair as if it could answer him. The candles on the table had burned low, their wax pooling into quiet shapes in the soft Denver evening. Laughter drifted from the kitchen, where his family tried to keep things warm, but the space across from Vana remained untouched, her fork resting neatly on the napkin, her smile growing thinner by the minute. The lamp above her cast a gentle glow, making the loneliness on her face impossible to ignore. It was her birthday, and the man she loved was miles away, high above the city, working in a room made of glass. For all his wealth, all his control, all his certainty, he couldn't show up for the one thing that mattered. If you've ever cared for someone who kept choosing everything but you, this story may feel achingly familiar. Let's begin. By the time the last candle collapsed into warm wax, Vana knew he wasn't coming. The thought drifted through her mind as she stared at the candles, their thin flames trembling in the soft draft moving through Valerie Reeves's dining room. The house sat in a quiet suburb just outside Denver, wrapped in early spring chill, the kind that clung to window panes and deepened the stillness inside. Warm lamplight softened the room, turning the wooden table into something gentle and inviting. Yet one chair remained untouched, its place setting perfectly aligned, its napkin still folded like nothing had begun. Lauren tried to cut the silence with a small laugh. Maybe he hit traffic on I-25 again. You know how Denver gets this time of night. Her voice aimed for light, but even from where Vana sat, she sensed the strain. Lauren's smile disappeared almost as fast as it appeared, folding into something apologetic. "It's only 7:15, Valerie said, smoothing the edge of the tablecloth for the third time. He probably got held up in a meeting. He always underestimates how long they run. She spoke with a kind of motherly loyalty, but her eyes flicked toward the hallway where Michael should have walked in by now. Vana nodded, offering a small smile as if she believed it too, but her chest felt tight beneath the fabric of her emerald dress. She had chosen the dress carefully, wanting to look nice but not excessive. She'd stood in her bathroom mirror earlier that evening, steadying her breath, reminding herself not to hope for too much. Michael wasn't a man of celebrations. Still, she thought tonight might be different. The room smelled faintly of roasted chicken and fresh herbs, Valerie's kindness woven quietly into the meal. 3 plates waited, steam growing thinner by the minute. 2 glasses of wine had lost their chill. Her own fork felt heavy in her hand as she tried to keep her expression relaxed, presentable, composed. Her phone vibrated softly beside her plate. She didn't need to open the message to know, but she did anyway. Running late, big deal closing, don't wait. Her breath caught not enough to be noticed if someone wasn't watching closely. Lauren was... Their eyes met for a split second, and Lauren's face tightened with sympathy. Her apology lived in that glance, quiet and sincere. Vana placed the phone face down, the gesture small but decisive. "It's okay," she said gently, though her voice felt thinner than usual. "Let's eat. Everything smells wonderful." Valerie reached for the serving spoon, but her movements slowed, as if she sensed the shift in Vana's tone. She handed Vana the bowl of potatoes first, almost as a comfort offering. They ate, but conversation thinned into polite threads that never tied into anything real. Lauren asked about the non-profit event Vana was working on. Valerie asked whether the weather had been warm enough yet for hiking. Vana answered with care, grateful for their effort, but every response felt like stepping on a bruise. She kept glancing at the doorway, then reminding herself not to. Outside, the evening dimmed further, the sky leaning into a deeper blue. The windows reflected the dining room, 3 people trying to pretend an empty chair wasn't the loudest presence in the house. "You sure you're okay?" Sweetheart Valerie asked softly, reaching across to touch Vanna's hand. "I'm fine." It sounded believable, even to her own ears. Years of steady independence had made her good at smoothing edges, but she felt something inside her slide slightly out of place, the kind of shift that didn't make noise but changed the way air moved in a room. As they finished eating, Lauren pushed her chair back with a quiet sigh. "I'll put on some coffee. Maybe he'll show before dessert." She stood, leaving the words hovering like a question no one wanted to answer. Vanna excused herself before the coffee was ready. She stepped toward the patio doors, drawn by the need for fresh air, something cool enough to settle her quivering thoughts. The moment she slipped outside, the chill wrapped around her like a tide returning to shore. The quiet hit her first, the kind of quiet that made every breath sound louder. She leaned both hands against the railing, the wood cool beneath her palms. Her eyes traced the outline of the backyard Valerie's garden, sleeping under early spring, soil still dark and waiting for warmer days. Fairy lights along the fence glowed softly, their warm bulbs flickering in the breeze. Her smile finally fell. No witnesses, no expectations, just the truth. She had told herself she wouldn't let this happen again, that she wouldn't anchor her heart to someone who lived constantly in another world. But Michael had a way of making her believe small promises. He spoke gently. He looked at her as if he saw something steady in her. And on the days he showed up, he made her feel like she mattered. But nights like this, nights with empty chairs and cooling dinners, they whispered something she didn't want to hear. Her breath fogged in front of her. She watched it dissipate, wishing she could let her longing dissolve as easily. Inside, she heard Lauren's soft voice, then Valerie's. Neither called her back in. They understood. She pressed her fingertips to her forehead and let her eyes close. She didn't want to resent Michael. She didn't want to be unreasonable. But the weight of disappointment sat deep, no longer sharp, but tired, aching. A shiver moved through her as the wind shifted. Somewhere in the house. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't pick it up. She stayed at the railing, staring at the garden lights, wondering how many quiet hurts a heart could take before it stopped making excuses for someone. And beneath that thought, another one formed quiet, unwelcome, impossible to ignore. What could possibly be so important that he would forget this 46 floors above the city? Michael didn't notice the time or the silence waiting for him miles away. The office lights had thinned to a low hum, most of the building already gone dark. Only his corner suite still glowed against the Denver skyline, its wide glass windows casting him into the night like a man standing inside a lantern. He stood over his desk, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a knot of tension carved between his brows. The city sprawled beneath him, cars threading through the streets like restless sparks, rooftops catching the fading hue of evening. None of it reached him. The world out there looked distant, almost unreal, as if it belonged to someone else. A contract lay open before him, pages marked with notes in his tight handwriting. He read the same paragraph twice, then a third time, his mind refusing to settle. A half-finished cup of coffee had gone cold at his elbow. He lifted it anyway, took a sip, winced at the bitterness, and set it back down. He had lived like this for years, long nights, long shadows, and a life measured in deadlines. His staff admired him for it. Investors trusted him because of it. But beneath the surface of discipline and control, something older gnawed quietly at him. His father's face rose in memory, not the confident businessman he had once been, but the defeated man at the end. Michael still saw him standing in their old living room, folders spread across the coffee table, his voice breaking as he admitted he had lost nearly everything. Michael had been a young man then, old enough to understand, helpless to stop the unraveling. That night had branded him. He worked because he had to. Because failure wasn't abstract, it wore his father's exhausted eyes. It lived in the silence that followed, in the foreclosure letter taped to their front door, in the way his mother packed boxes without speaking. He exhaled slowly, forcing the memory back into its cage. He had built an empire to outrun that past, but the fear followed him like a cold draft through a closed room. A notification blinked on his phone. He didn't look at it. Not yet. His eyes dragged back to the contract, to the numbers he'd memorized, to the margin he needed to finalize before morning. If the merger went through cleanly, his company would double its foothold in the Southwest. A lifetime of stability compressed into one deal. The seconds ticked by. The office felt too still. Finally, he reached for his phone. The reminder glowed on the screen, simple and merciless. Vana, 7 p.m. Michael froze, his breath catching like it collided with something in his chest. He checked the corner of the screen. 8:12 p. Damn it, he muttered, the words slipping out before he could silence them. He pressed his fingers to his forehead, squeezing hard, as if pressure alone could force back the clock. He tried to picture her sitting with his sister, with his mother, waiting for him. He imagined the candles, the table set with more care than he ever gave his own meals. He imagined her smile, always gentle, always patient. And then he imagined the moment that smile began to fade. Guilt flickered, sharp and unwelcome. He stood abruptly, pushing the chair back, pacing across the office. The floor-to-ceiling windows threw his reflection back at him. For a moment, he stopped, looking at himself as if he were someone else. The man staring back was sharply dressed, hair slightly mussed from hours of work, jaw tight, eyes rimmed with fatigue. But there was something else in the reflection, an emptiness he could no longer attribute to late nights or stress. He looked like a man living in a glass cage, admired from a distance but trapped inside the life he had built. His phone buzzed again. A message from Lauren. "You're missing her birthday dinner." He read it twice, the words blunt enough to cut through every excuse he tried to summon. He grabbed his suit jacket from the back of his chair. Then he hesitated. He checked the time again. 8:18. The drive would take at least 25 minutes. Dinner would be long over. Maybe she'd already gone home. Maybe the hurt was already done. His hand loosened on the jacket. The old fear crept in, the fear of stepping away from work for even an hour. Deals could sour overnight. Opportunities slipped fast in his world. His father had thought things would run fine on their own. One miscalculation later, everything fell apart. Michael had spent 20 years vowing he'd never repeat that mistake. But tonight the vow felt less like discipline and more like a chain. He walked to the window again, staring down at the city. The glass reflected a man who had everything he once wanted: success, control, respect, and yet couldn't keep a promise as simple as showing up for someone who cared about him. He lifted his phone, thumb hovering over the screen. Should he call? Would it make things better, or only prove he hadn't thought of her until now? The buzz of an incoming email filled the room, sharp and insistent. He looked at the subject line. A late update on the merger. His chest tightened. He knew he should stay. He always stayed. He closed his eyes for a moment. His mind pulled in two directions: duty and longing, fear and regret. He couldn't remember the last time he had allowed himself to choose something that wasn't driven by survival. His hand tightened around the phone. What would happen if he walked away from the office right now? What would happen if he let himself show up, truly show up for her? He stood there, suspended between habit and hope, the city lights flickering at his back, the empty office humming with the weight of a choice he wasn't ready to make. And for the first time that night, he whispered a question he didn't know how to answer. Was he about to lose something he couldn't rebuild? The night Lauren brought her friend over, Michael expected small talk. He didn't expect stillness. He had come home late, as usual, shoulders tight from hours spent navigating another round of negotiations. The Reeves family home sat quiet beneath the early spring dusk, porch lights glowing softly against the pale Colorado sky. Inside, he could hear laughter drifting from the kitchen light, unforced, the kind that didn't often fill the house anymore. He slipped off his jacket, loosened his tie, and walked down the hallway. When he reached the doorway, he paused. Lauren stood at the counter slicing vegetables, humming under her breath. But it wasn't her voice that stopped him. It was the woman beside her, hands dusted with flour, sleeves pushed up, hair pinned loosely at the back of her neck as she leaned over a bowl of dough. Warm light from the hanging fixtures touched her face, softening the edges, bringing out the quiet concentration in her eyes. Vana. He had heard her name in passing before, mentioned lightly by his sister, but he hadn't expected this. A sense of calm radiated from her, something steady and familiar, like a memory he couldn't quite place. Lauren noticed him first. "There you are," she said with a grin. "I thought you'd be chained to that office forever." Vanna looked up then. Her smile was gentle, unhurried. "Hi, Michael. It's nice to see you again." He nodded, suddenly aware of how tense he was compared to the warmth of the room. "Evening? Didn't realize we had company." Lauren rolled her eyes as she handed Vana a dish towel. "I told you last week. We needed help organizing the charity auction, and Vana's the only one who actually knows what she's doing." Vanna laughed softly. The sound so natural, it shifted something inside him. She moved to the sink, rinsed her hands, then began drying them with patient strokes of the towel. The motion was simple, ordinary, but there was a quiet grace to it, the kind that made the moment feel strangely intimate. Michael stepped further inside. "Can I help with anything?" Lauren lifted a brow. "Since when do you help in the kitchen?" He gave her a look. "Since now." Vana smiled again, softer this time. "If you want, you can carry the platters to the dining room. Dinner's almost ready." He found himself nodding before he had time to think. His fingers brushed hers briefly as she handed him a plate, and something warm flickered beneath his ribs, unexpected, unfamiliar. At the dining table, he set things down carefully, listening to the low murmur of voices from the kitchen. He wasn't used to this kind of evening anymore, home-cooked food, laughter mixing with the clatter of bowls, a house filled with uncomplicated warmth. His life had narrowed to offices, schedules, screens. Here, the air felt different, lighter. When the three of them finally sat down, conversation flowed easily between the women. They talked about the auction, a local outreach program, and a community center that needed funding. Michael listened, contributing when spoken to, but mostly noticing the way Vana's eyes brightened when she talked about helping families in need. She spoke with quiet conviction, not to impress, not to dominate the table, just to share something she cared about. He hadn't realized how rare that kind of sincerity felt to him until now. At one point, Lauren stepped away to take a phone call. The sudden silence between him and Vana settled gently. Not awkward, not heavy, just present. She took a sip of water, then looked at him with a calm curiosity. "Long day?" she asked. He exhaled slowly. "They all are? That sounds exhausting. It comes with the job. But that doesn't mean it should take everything from you." He looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time without the noise of the room around them. Her gaze wasn't demanding or disappointed. It was simply honest, grounded, the kind of honesty he wasn't used to anymore. "Maybe not," he said quietly. A small pause stretched between them, a pause that felt more like a beginning than an interruption. When Lauren returned, they moved into the living room with coffee and a stack of documents for the charity event. Michael expected to tune out, but Vanna's voice kept drawing him back in. She offered suggestions, thought through logistics, and laughed at her own doodled notes in the margins. Her laughter was soft, a warm ripple he hadn't expected to notice. As the night deepened, the conversation shifted. Somehow he found himself telling her about a renewable energy project he'd been working on, something he rarely discussed outside of business circles. She listened closely, asking questions that weren't superficial. She understood more than he assumed she would, offering perspectives that made him pause. Time slipped by. The room dimmed as the house settled into nighttime stillness. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking minutes he hadn't meant to spend. When Lauren finally stood and stretched, announcing she was exhausted, Michael felt a faint reluctance tug at him. He hadn't felt that in a long time. He walked Vana to the door. The porch light cast a soft gold halo around her as she pulled on her coat. She zipped it halfway, then turned to him. "It was nice talking with you," she said, her voice gentle but sincere. "You too," he replied, and he meant it. She stepped onto the porch, then paused. "You should get some rest. Michael, you look like you haven't slept well in weeks." He almost smiled. "Maybe I'll try." She gave a small nod, then walked toward her car, her figure fading into the cool night. He stood there longer than he intended, hands in his pockets, watching the taillights disappear. When he finally went back inside, the house felt too quiet again, too empty after the warmth she left behind. He went to his study, turned on the desk lamp, and opened his laptop. But his mind refused to return to the numbers. Instead, he saw flour on her hands, the curve of her smile, the steady way she held a conversation, the softness in her voice when she said his name. He closed the laptop. For the first time in years, he found himself sitting still, wondering why a single evening refused to let him go. Michael liked numbers, yet he couldn't quantify why her presence steadied the room. It began subtly, almost quietly, an ease settling in the spaces where he'd long grown accustomed to tension. He noticed it one Saturday afternoon during a small family lunch. The Reeves dining room glowed with afternoon sun, catching dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. And Vana sat at the far end of the table, listening to Lauren recount a story about work. She wasn't trying to fill the silence or command attention. She simply listened, really listened, nodding, smiling gently, offering a soft question when the moment called for it. He found himself watching her more than he intended. After lunch, when Lauren and Valerie disappeared into the kitchen with dishes, he remained in the living room, scrolling through his emails, even though none needed immediate attention. Vana stepped inside a moment later, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She set one in front of him and kept the other for herself. "I remember you said you like it with just a splash of cream," she said. He looked up, surprised she'd noticed. "Thank you." She curled into the corner of the sofa, sitting with a comfortable posture, not stiff or self-conscious. Her presence softened the room in a way he couldn't explain. They talked about the charity auction, about a book she'd been reading, about a documentary he'd watched years ago. The mugs warmed their hands for a while, then slowly cooled as their conversation drifted into deeper waters. Work, aging parents, regret, small joys they never talked about with anyone else. He wasn't sure when it happened, but at some point he realized he had stopped checking his phone. Another weekend, a similar moment. They walked through Valerie's backyard after dinner, the grass soft beneath their shoes, the sky painted in streaks of fading gold. The air smelled faintly of the pine trees lining the yard. Vana wrapped her arms around herself against the breeze, and he instinctively offered her his jacket. She hesitated only a second before slipping it on. "It's warm," she murmured. "Thank you." Michael wasn't used to gestures like that, not the giving, and certainly not the receiving. Yet watching her pull the jacket closer around her made something quiet shift inside him. It wasn't dramatic, just a small, steadying tug. The pattern continued over the next few weeks. Unplanned moments, small gatherings, quiet evenings where she arrived to help Lauren prepare brochures for the fundraiser or to drop off something for Valerie. Each time she came, Michael found himself drifting toward whatever room she occupied, without meaning to, without thinking about what it meant. She asked real questions, the kind that made him pause. How do you know when a project is worth the stress? What do you do when your mind won't turn off at night? Does running a company ever stop feeling like you're chasing something? He never answered all of them fully. Some touched places he didn't open often, but she never pushed. She let him choose how much to share. And for a man who lived under constant scrutiny, that gentle patience felt like an unexpected mercy. Sometimes he wondered if she could feel the tension under his calm exterior, the way fear and ambition tangled together, tight and exhausting. She didn't seem afraid of his silence, and that baffled him more than anything. One evening, late in the spring, they found themselves alone again after a family movie night. Lauren had gone upstairs to fold laundry. Valerie was already asleep. The house felt hushed, held in that muted stillness that came only after a long, full day. Vana stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing 2 wine glasses. The warm overhead light cast a soft glow on her shoulders. Michael leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely, watching her without meaning to. "You work too much," she said gently, not turning around. "You've mentioned that before. Only because it's true." He exhaled slowly. "It's not something I know how to change." She shut off the faucet and turned to face him fully, her expression calm, not confrontational. "I'm not asking you to change for me. Sometimes I think you deserve more than the life you let yourself have. More? The word hung between them. I don't know what that looks like, he admitted quietly. A softness warmed her eyes. Maybe you don't have to figure it out alone. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed with something he wasn't ready to name. He felt the familiar instinct rising, the urge to pull back, to reinforce the walls that kept him focused, disciplined, safe. But the sight of her standing there, patient, steady, unafraid of his uncertainty, made those walls feel heavier than usual. He stepped a little closer, not enough to break the fragile air between them, but enough that he could see the subtle change in her breathing. I should head out, she said quietly, though something in her voice suggested she wasn't quite ready to leave either. He nodded, but didn't move. I'll walk you to the door. They moved through the living room together, footsteps soft on the rug. At the front door, she slipped into her coat, smoothing the collar with slow, thoughtful hands. When she looked up, he saw a question in her eyes, a gentle wondering, not a demand. "Good night, Michael." "Good night," he replied, but his voice sounded lower, weighted with something he didn't fully understand. She opened the door, the night air spilling in, cool and fragrant. For a moment, neither of them stepped away. Something unspoken hovered, close enough to touch. He felt himself leaning into the possibility of saying something, anything that would bridge the small, charged space between them. But fear tugged harder, so he stayed silent. She gave a faint, knowing smile, then walked out into the dark, her figure blending with the soft glow of the porch light before the door closed behind her. He stood there long after she left, the echo of her presence lingering in the quiet house, and somewhere inside him, a restless question stirred, one he wasn't sure he knew how to face. Was he ready to let someone in? Even a little Vana waited outside the cafe, watching couples pass by. Her coffee had already gone cold. The late afternoon light stretched long across the sidewalk, warming the brick walls beside her, but she barely felt it. She kept glancing at the street, searching for his car, even though she already knew he wasn't coming. The certainty had settled in her chest 20 minutes ago, then sharpened when her phone buzzed, running late. Something came up. Something. It was always something, always urgent, always louder than her. She wrapped her hands around the paper cup, the warmth long gone. Around her, the small outdoor tables filled with people leaning close, sharing conversations she couldn't hear, laughter rising above the soft hum of traffic. Across from her, an older couple held hands over their pastries, smiling at some private joke. She found herself watching them, a sting of longing catching her off guard. It wasn't the romance she envied, it was the simple act of choosing each other, even for half an hour in a crowded cafe. She checked the time again, 40 minutes past their agreed meeting. She drew a long breath, soft but shaky, and stood. She didn't leave, though. Instead, she hovered beside the table, unsure of whether she wanted him to appear late or not at all. When Michael finally arrived, he strode toward her with a determined pace, as if speed alone could erase the delay. His shirt sleeves were still rolled, his tie askew, a tension anchoring his shoulders. He looked like a man pulled in too many directions and one of them had frayed loose. "I'm sorry," he said before she could speak. "The meeting ran long. I tried to get out sooner." She studied him for a moment, searching his face. "You canceled 10 minutes after we were supposed to meet." He hesitated. "I thought I could make it, but you didn't." Her voice wasn't sharp, just tired. That tiredness unsettled him more than any anger would have. He glanced at the table behind her, at the lonely cup still sitting there. "You waited?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "A little while." Guilt flickered in his eyes. Real, raw. She wasn't used to seeing it there. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, a gesture that belonged to someone facing a problem he couldn't calculate his way out of. "I'm sorry," he repeated, softer this time. She swallowed. "Michael, I don't need perfection. I don't need fancy dinners or grand gestures. But I do need to feel like I matter. Even just a little. He looked at her, then really looked, and something in his expression shifted. A crack, thin but unmistakable. It wasn't disappointment in her. It was something closer to fear. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as a breeze stirred the napkins on the abandoned cafe table. "You do matter," he said. I'm not good at this. I'm not asking you to be perfect at this." She replied, "I'm asking you to show up. To try." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "I don't know how to balance everything. When things pile up at work, I just shut everything else out. It's how I keep things from falling apart." "And where does that leave the people who care about you?" she asked, her voice no louder than before. He didn't answer. A gust of wind brushed past them, scattering a few leaves across the sidewalk. The moment felt suspended, too fragile, too honest. He shifted his weight, searching for words he didn't know how to form. "My father," he began, then stopped, jaw tightening. "I've seen what happens when someone lets their guard down. I can't afford to do that." Vana watched him struggle, watched the fear beneath the professionalism he always wore. And for the first time, frustration overcame her compassion. "I'm not asking you to let your guard down at work," she said. "I'm asking you not to shut me out." The words landed between them like something delicate and breakable. He turned his head slightly, as if absorbing the truth of it. Then he looked back at her, eyes quieter now. "I should have been here," he said. "I know that. And I'm sorry. Not just for today." The sincerity in his voice startled her. She had expected excuses, maybe even defensiveness. But not this. Not him standing in front of her with a voice that seemed to tremble on the edges of vulnerability. She felt her anger loosen, though it didn't disappear. A soft ache remained, steady and real. "I don't want to keep feeling like an afterthought," she said. "You're not," he replied immediately, too quickly. He caught himself. "At least, you shouldn't be. This is all new to me." She nodded slowly. The street around them grew busier, cars rolling by, conversations floating past. But their small corner felt strangely still. He looked down at the cold coffee cup, then lifted his eyes to hers. "Let me make it up to you," he said. "Tonight, tomorrow, whenever you want. I mean it." She studied him again. Part of her wanted to say yes. Another part whispered caution. But seeing him stand there tired, flawed, trying twisted something inside her she couldn't ignore. "Maybe," she said softly. He gave a faint nod, almost relieved she hadn't walked away. He stepped back, hands in his pockets, waiting for her to move, to decide, to say something more. But she stayed still. She wasn't ready to give him an answer. Not yet. A breeze tugged at the edge of her jacket, and she wrapped it tighter around herself. He watched her, the question rising quietly between them, one he didn't voice, but she felt all the same. Could a man who lived his life in fear learn how to show up for someone waiting in the cold when Vana showed up at his office with lunch? Michael looked at her like she'd stepped into another universe. He had been standing behind his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled, eyes fixed on a spreadsheet projected on the wall. The glow of the screen washed his face in cold light until she walked in, carrying a canvas bag that smelled faintly of warm herbs and roasted vegetables. She paused in the doorway. "You said you hadn't eaten." He blinked, almost startled. "I didn't expect you to come all the way here." "I was nearby," she said. Even though she wasn't, it didn't matter. She smiled and stepped inside. The air shifted, not dramatically, just enough to make him drop his shoulders an inch, enough to soften his jaw. She began unpacking the containers on the corner of his cluttered desk, nudging aside stacks of reports and a half-empty cup of black coffee. The office was too modern, too sharp glass, steel, and screens. Her presence, with its warmth and simple groundedness, made the space feel briefly human. He watched her open each container. Warm air rose fresh bread, roasted chicken, a simple salad tossed with lemon dressing. "You didn't have to do all this," he murmured. "I know," she replied gently. That's why I did. For a moment he didn't move, as if unsure how to step into the moment being offered to him. Then he pulled his chair forward and sat. She took the seat opposite him, folding her hands in her lap, watching him with quiet patience. He took a bite, closed his eyes. This is good. That's a very dramatic pause, she teased softly. It's been a long time since I tasted something that wasn't handed to me in a takeout bag. They ate mostly in silence, but it wasn't awkward. It was the calm kind, the kind he didn't realize he'd been starving for. Every few minutes they exchanged a small comment or a quiet laugh. Somewhere halfway through the meal, he caught himself looking at her instead of the numbers on his screen, and he didn't feel guilty about it. The next week, she came again, this time with homemade soup and cornbread. Only 20 minutes, she warned. I know you're buried in deadlines. He nodded, grateful and uncomfortable at the same time. She unpacked the food as he wrapped up a call, her movements unhurried. When he finally hung up, he said, I didn't expect you today. She shrugged lightly. You didn't have to. He watched her spoon soup into a small bowl, steam curling into the air. Something tightened in his chest, not unpleasant, but unsettling. He wasn't used to anyone showing up simply because they cared. Not without wanting something. Not without strings. Vana, he said quietly, you don't have to take care of me. I'm not taking care of you, she replied. I'm keeping you company? He didn't know how to answer that. Her visits became small anchors in the blur of his week. On her days off, she'd drop by around 1 or 2, staying just long enough for him to breathe differently. They didn't discuss the missed cafe meeting again. She didn't ask for promises he wasn't ready to make. She didn't push. She just appeared an offering of time, not expectation. And Michael found himself laughing more, not loudly, but enough that his assistants exchanged knowing glances whenever he walked past. One Thursday afternoon, as she unpacked a warm container of baked pasta, Adrian, his longtime COO, knocked on the open door. Boss. The numbers from he stopped mid-sentence when he saw Vana. Oh, Adrian said with a surprised smile. Thought the board catered lunch today. No, Michael replied, a faint edge of defensiveness slipping in. Just lunch. Adrian nodded, but not before giving Michael an expression that suggested he understood more than he should. After he left, Michael looked at Vana, uneasy. They're going to assume things, he said. Let them, she replied, without hesitation. He stared at her. It bothers me. Why he frowned? Because I don't know what this is yet. He gestured between them, the space charged with more truth than he intended to show. Vana nodded slowly. Then, don't define it. Not right now. Her calmness disarmed him. She wasn't demanding labels or pushing him into a corner. She was simply there, offering moments small but steady like warmth seeping through cracks in a frozen door. The next week, he found himself sleeping more deeply than he had in years. His nights, long plagued by tension, felt lighter. He noticed details he used to ignore, the way morning light hit the floor of his kitchen, the quiet hum of his car as he drove, the sound of his own breathing when he paused between meetings. One afternoon, he opened his office door to find his receptionist smiling. You look rested today, she said. He blinked. Do I different? She said gently, in a good way. It unsettled him how noticeable the shift was, as if the small comfort Vana brought was visible beyond his own chest. He wondered if he was changing, or if change was simply drifting toward him. So quietly he hadn't realized the distance he'd traveled. Later that evening, after the office emptied, he stood alone by the window. Denver glowed beneath him, streets lit in soft gold, buildings gleaming against the darkening sky. His reflection stared back from the glass, a man who had built an empire on discipline and fear, now softened by something he couldn't quantify. He thought of Vana unpacking warm containers on his messy desk, her patience, her laughter, the way her presence steadied the air around him, and he wondered, fear creeping in like a shadow, whether he was changing because he wanted to, or because for the first time in his life, Someone simply stayed long enough for him to drift toward them. He lifted a hand toward the glass, tracing the edge of his reflection. Was he drifting, or beginning to choose? She found him standing alone against the Denver skyline, rain streaking down the window like someone else's tears. The storm had rolled in fast, swallowing the last of the city's evening light. From the hallway, Vana could see his silhouette, broad shoulders outlined against a sheet of gray that flickered with distant lightning. His jacket was draped over a chair, his tie loosened, his posture defeated in a way she had never seen. She closed the door behind her softly. "You're still here." He turned, startled. "I could say the same about you. I brought dinner," she said, lifting the paper bag slightly. "Thought you might need it." He nodded but didn't move, as if leaving the window required more energy than he had left. The office felt different tonight, darker, quieter, as though even the lamps were tired. The rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling glass, steady and relentless. She set the food on the small sofa near the corner, then looked back at him. "Michael," she said gently, "come sit." He inhaled a shallow breath, then crossed the room and lowered himself onto the sofa beside her. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the rain and the faint hum of the air vent overhead. "I wasn't expecting you," he said finally. "You never do," she replied, but there was no edge to it, just truth. She unpacked the still-warm containers, rosemary potatoes, grilled chicken, a small slice of chocolate cake wrapped carefully in foil. He watched her hands move, slow and sure, and something inside him loosened. "You didn't have to do all this," he murmured. "I know." She offered him the fork. "Eat anyway." He took it. They ate in a rare, easy silence, close, but not touching. The storm outside washed the city in blurred white and gray, light smearing like watercolor strokes across the window. After a few minutes, Vana spoke quietly. "You look exhausted." "I am. Why are you still here at 10 at night?" He didn't answer. His fork paused midair. She turned a little toward him. "Michael." He kept staring at the rain. "You're afraid," she said softly. His jaw tightened. He didn't argue, didn't pretend, didn't brush it aside with logic or schedules or numbers. He simply breathed out, "I know." Her voice lowered. "Afraid of what everything," he said. "Losing what I've built, becoming my father, not being enough." His fingers tapped against his knee once, twice, then stilled. "And I don't know how to stop." The words came out rough, as if dragged through gravel. Vana set the container aside and folded her hands in her lap. Stopping doesn't mean failing. It did for him. "You're not him." He closed his eyes, as though he wanted to believe it but couldn't quite reach the feeling. A quiet stretched between them, not empty charged, heavy, the kind of quiet that shifts the air. Slowly, she reached out and touched his arm, a small gesture, barely more than a brush of fingers. But he inhaled sharply, as if the contact cracked open something he'd been holding closed for too long. "Michael," she whispered, "you don't always have to carry everything alone." He turned his head. Her face was only a few inches away, soft in the dim light, shadowed by concern, steady with patience. Rainlight flickered across her features, making her seem both near and distant at once. He didn't think, didn't plan, didn't calculate. He leaned in. Their lips met with the gentlest pressure. A kiss that wasn't meant to happen yet felt inevitable, quiet and unhurried, like two people stepping into a warm room after standing too long in the cold. The storm outside seemed to fade, though the rain still traced lines down the glass behind them. When they parted, he looked at her for a long moment, breath uneven. "I don't know how to do this," he said, voice low. "You don't have to know everything," she replied. "Just let me help." He swallowed hard, throat tight, a man who mastered billion-dollar decisions, undone by a single offer spoken softly in a darkened room. Outside, thunder rolled across the city. Inside, he felt something shift, something he couldn't name and wasn't sure he trusted. Vana, He began, but the rest of the sentence failed him. She waited, hands folded calmly, patient as always. Did he want this? Yes. Was he ready for it? He didn't know. Was he capable of choosing something other than fear? He had no idea. The storm pressed its palms against the glass, like a reminder that nothing stays still forever. He looked down at her hand resting near his, close enough to touch again, close enough to take, close enough to lose. And he wondered achingly, honestly, if he could let himself step towards something he couldn't control. For the first time in years, Michael heard himself laugh a sound that startled him more than it should have. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning in his kitchen, sunlight spilling across the granite countertops and stirring dust motes into a slow dance. He'd tried flipping pancakes the way he remembered from childhood, and the first one came out scorched on one side, pale on the other. When he held it up in defeat, Vana burst into laughter behind him, warm and unguarded. He looked over his shoulder, spatula raised like a white flag. This is not how they looked online. "They're perfect," she said, coming beside him and nudging his arm lightly. Perfectly chaotic. He felt his mouth curve soft, surprised. The simple domestic scene wrapped around him like a blanket he hadn't known he needed. The pan hissed quietly as he poured another round of batter, trying again, wanting to get it right. Most of their mornings were like that now, slow, gentle, different from the sharp-edged life he'd built for years. She would lean against the counter with her tea, watching him with that patient gaze that steadied something inside him. On weekdays, he still woke before dawn, still scanned emails before brushing his teeth, still carried a weight he couldn't name. But on weekends, Vana's presence created a different rhythm, soft breakfasts, long drives through the foothills west of Denver, windows cracked for the cool air, conversations drifting from music to childhood memories to questions he'd never asked anyone. And yet, even within these gentle days, the old habits tugged at him. He would reach for his phone at red lights, would glance at his watch too often, would drift in the middle of her sentences, pulled by thoughts of markets, projections, strategy. She never scolded him. That almost made it worse. One Saturday morning, as they stood outside a small bookstore they had stumbled upon in a historic neighborhood, he realized he didn't even remember the last few words she'd spoken. She was looking at a window display of dusty editions, her reflection faint in the glass, her hands tucked into her jacket pockets. He stepped closer. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She shifted her eyes toward him, not moving her head. For what? For disappearing. While standing right here, her expression softened, though a tiny crease remained between her brows. She didn't answer right away, and the pause pressed on him more than any lecture could have. He reached for her hand. "I'm trying." "I know," she said, threading her fingers through his. "That's why I stay." They walked inside together, and for a while, the air felt lighter again. The scent of old pages, the warm creak of wooden floors. It all reminded him of a childhood he rarely spoke about, back when life had been simpler, before he learned what it cost to lose everything. But the push and pull between who he was and who he wanted to be followed him like a shadow. A few days later, on a Wednesday he was supposed to work late. He found himself staring at his office door, wondering if it mattered that much, wondering if his father's mistakes had really built the rules he'd been living by, or if he'd built them himself. The question lingered long after he locked up early and drove home to find Vanna reading on his sofa, her feet tucked beneath her hair falling loosely around her shoulders, her smile small. Surprise made something in his chest settle. Still, the doubts crept in during quiet moments. Could he truly give her the life she deserved? Could he protect what they were building without sacrificing everything he had spent decades constructing? Was he enough for her? Or would she eventually see the cracks and decide she wanted a man with less baggage one evening? As she washed her hands at his kitchen sink, sleeves rolled to her elbows, he caught her profile reflected in the window. She looked peaceful in a way he rarely felt. He wondered if she sensed the fracture lines inside him, or if she believed he was steadier than he feared. He wanted to deserve the way she looked at him. The next Saturday, he surprised even himself. By mid-morning, he closed his laptop with a decisive snap and walked into the living room where she was folding a blanket. "Get your coat," he said. She blinked. "Why, because," he replied, slipping into his jacket. "I'm taking you somewhere." She studied him a long second, searching his face for the catch. When she found none, she reached for her scarf. They drove north, the highway opening into wide plains and soft rolling hills. He kept the destination to himself until he pulled into the small lakeside town he hadn't visited since college. It was quiet this time of year, cold breeze sweeping off the water, geese drifting near the reeds, the smell of pine heavy in the air. She stepped out of the car slowly, looking around with wonder. "Michael, this is beautiful. I thought you might like it." They walked the narrow paths along the lake, their breath turning white in the crisp air. The silence between them was comfortable, a counterweight to the storm they had weathered weeks earlier. He found himself watching her without meaning to, the way her cheeks reddened from the wind, the way she tucked her hair into her scarf, the way she paused to take in small things he would have overlooked. He had brought her here without a plan, without a reason beyond wanting to be close, wanting to offer something of himself that wasn't tied to spreadsheets or strategy or fear. It was the first spontaneous thing he'd done in years. They stopped near the shore, where the water lapped gently at a line of cracked stones. "It's peaceful," she said. "It is," he answered. "And you look different today." He didn't know if that was praise or warning. The breeze chilled the space between them, and he rubbed his hands together once. "I'm trying," he said again, softer this time. "I see that," she replied. I hope this isn't temporary." Her words landed like a pebble dropped into still water, small but echoing. He glanced at the lake, then back at her, wanting to say something certain, something that would reassure both of them. But the truth was tangled, complicated, still forming inside him. The geese took flight suddenly, wings beating loud against the quiet. He watched them rise, then lowered his gaze to Vana's patient eyes, wondering, fearing how long he could hold this fragile season before life pulled him back into old patterns. They waited for him. Again and again. The words moved like a quiet drumbeat in Vana's mind as she set her napkin on her lap, forcing her hands to stay still. The dining room glowed with warm amber light. Lauren had dimmed the overhead chandelier to make the candles stand out more, but that only made the empty chair look sharper, as if absence itself had taken a seat at the table. Her birthday dinner, the one night she hoped he would mark on his calendar without needing a reminder, without Lauren nudging him, without her mother-in-law-to-be gently looping him into the family group chat. She had told herself this year would be different, that maybe the cracks were healing, that maybe the months of effort hers. Theirs meant he would show up not out of duty but desire. But here she was, again, smoothing the same fold of her napkin until the fabric warmed beneath her fingertips. Lauren tried to distract her, offering light jokes, offering more wine, offering anything that would keep Vana's eyes from drifting back to the clock. Across the table, Valerie sat with her gentle, practiced grace, speaking in soft notes meant to soothe. "He'll walk through the door any minute," Valerie said, though her voice carried an undertone that hinted she wasn't sure anymore. Vana nodded, a polite curve of her lips holding the shape of a smile. She didn't want Lauren worrying. She didn't want Valerie feeling guilty. She didn't want to break down in front of two people who genuinely cared for her. She had always believed the worst pains were the ones you endured quietly, preserving the dignity of everyone in the room. But the candles burned lower, wax pooling at the base like melted courage. Dinner cooled, laughter faded, and his chair remained untouched. Her phone vibrated against the table, a single buzz. Her pulse leapt before she even reached for it. One text, 2 sentences, running late, big deal closing, don't wait, no apology, no warmth, no mention of her birthday. Her breath caught. She set the phone down as calmly as she could, but inside, something small folded in on itself, a tiny fracture. The kind that didn't bleed, didn't scream, just deepened until it became a permanent line. Lauren saw the message over her shoulder. Her expression tightened, eyes flicking with an anger she tried to hide. Vana, I'm so sorry. It's okay, Vana whispered, though she didn't trust her voice enough to say more. The lie tasted thin. Valerie reached across the table, her hand warm over Vanna's. My dear, I know he cares. He's just busy, Vana finished softly. I know. She had said that word so many times over the last months that it had lost its meaning. Busy, like a shield he hid behind, like a wall she kept knocking on. The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful but strained, as if the walls themselves sensed the shift. Vana inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She lifted her fork, tried to eat a bite of the roast Valerie had poured love into, but the food felt heavy, unmoving. She set the fork down. I just need a moment, she said, rising before anyone could stop her. She stepped out through the patio door into the cold night. December air rushed to meet her, sharp against her skin, but it only deepened the ache in her chest. The neighborhood was quiet, distant porch lights glowing like soft lanterns. The sky brushed with winter clouds that hid the stars. She wrapped her arms around herself, breathing out in small clouds of white. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry. Not tonight. Not over another broken promise. Not over a text message that reduced something meaningful into an afterthought. But her eyes stung anyway. She hated that this felt familiar. That she had been here before, in one form or another, with other people who didn't choose her fully. People who liked her warmth, her steadiness, her ability to hold things together until they took it for granted. She leaned against the railing, palms pressed to the cold metal. She asked herself the question she had been avoiding for months. Was she slowly disappearing in this relationship, becoming smaller and smaller until she was nothing more than a gentle presence waiting for scraps of attention? Behind her, through the glass, she saw the dining room reflected Lauren and Valerie hovering near the table, unsure whether to comfort her or give her space. Their silhouettes looked blurred, distant. She felt a sudden swell of gratitude mixed with shame. She didn't want to ruin the evening for them, but she couldn't pretend anymore. Her phone buzzed again. She flinched. For half a second, hope lifted its head, stupid, persistent hope. She glanced at the screen, a calendar alert. Nothing more. She let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh or a sigh. Something in between. Her breath trembled. She closed her eyes. What are you doing? Vana. How long can you wait for a man who doesn't notice the waiting? The cold pressed deeper, as if reminding her she still had choices. After a long moment, she opened the patio door. Lauren stepped toward her, concern etched across her face. Vana, you don't have to pretend. Not with us. Vana swallowed. I know. Do you want us to call him? Lauren asked. Vana shook her head. No, I don't want him dragged here because someone else pulled him. Valerie approached gently. Would you like to stay? Or, do you need some air? Vana hesitated, searching for herself inside the question. I think, she said slowly, I need to go home. Lauren hugged her tightly, whispering an apology that wasn't hers to carry. Valerie pressed a warm hand to her shoulder, eyes speaking what words couldn't. Vana walked out the front door into the cool Denver night. Her heels clicked softly against the driveway, each step sounding louder than the last. The air tasted metallic, sharp, alive in a way she hadn't felt in a long while. She paused beside her car, gripping the door handle. She didn't know if this was a breaking point or just another wound she would learn to live with. But somewhere deep inside, a question rose quiet, tremoring, unignorable. How many more nights like this could her heart take when Michael stepped into his silent penthouse? He realized silence had an echo, one that bounced off the tall windows, the polished floors, the immaculate countertops. It followed him from room to room like a shadow, louder than any argument could have been. He set his keys down on the marble island. their small metallic clatter disappearing far too quickly. She had asked for space. He'd nodded, trying to stay composed, but somewhere between her doorway and the elevator ride down, something inside him had crumbled. Now, standing alone in the dim light of his own home, he felt the collapse fully. He opened the refrigerator without thinking, stared at the shelves, then closed it again. The emptiness there mirrored the emptiness in the room. He ordered takeout instead, something he didn't even want, and left the paper bag on the counter unopened. He didn't have the appetite to feed the body when the rest of him felt starved. He walked through the living room, fingertips brushing the back of the sofa where she had once curled up with a blanket. A faint impression of her lingered in the fabric, a presence so subtle he almost doubted it had been real. How could a woman fill a room so easily, yet leave it so completely barren when she walked away? He sank into the armchair near the window, the city lights glimmering up at him. Denver stretched out in quiet constellations of office buildings, parking lots, and distant headlights. Life went on out there. Deals were being made. People were returning home, somewhere, perhaps. Couples were arguing about trivial things, laughing over burnt dinners, holding each other before bed. He wondered what Vana was doing, whether she was also staring out a window, whether she was angry or simply tired, whether she was thinking of him or thinking of how to move on. He told himself space was reasonable, space was fair. She deserved clarity. She deserved rest from the constant tug-of-war between her needs and his fears. He couldn't blame her. He wouldn't blame her. But none of that logic softened the blow. He had agreed to space because he loved her, but also because he didn't know how to fight for her without learning how to fight himself. He thought work would help. It always had. The next morning, and the morning after that, he arrived at the office earlier than he needed to, drinking coffee so strong it burned down to his stomach. He sat through meetings with a distraction so sharp it felt like static in his mind. He reviewed reports twice, then again, not because they demanded it, but because he didn't know what else to do. People noticed. His assistant kept asking if he'd slept. His COO wondered why he was pushing deadlines that weren't urgent. His team treaded lightly around him, their voices softer, their jokes dying quickly in the room. He didn't laugh. He didn't even try. Every night, he returned to the penthouse, the silence greeting him like a disappointed neighbor. He left the TV off. Music felt wrong, lights too bright, darkness too honest. One evening, after another 12-hour stretch of trying to outrun his thoughts, he dropped his briefcase near the entryway and tugged at the knot of his tie. The apartment was dim, except for the under-cabinet lights in the kitchen, just bright enough to reveal the takeout box still sitting on the counter from 3 nights ago. He exhaled slowly. He walked past it toward the bedroom, toward the drawer he hadn't opened since she left. He didn't intend to open it tonight either. He was reaching for something else. Maybe a spare charger, maybe a sweater. But the moment his fingers pulled the handle, he froze. Inside the drawer lay a small, familiar stack of folded notes, the ones she used to leave him, the ones he wasn't ready to throw away. Some, he remembered, eat something real today. You look tired this morning. Don't forget to breathe. I'm proud of you. Call me when you have 5 minutes. I miss your voice. He hadn't realized how many he had saved, or how many he had ignored. He picked one up, one written on pale blue stationery. Her handwriting slanted slightly, elegant but simple. You don't have to be alone in everything. Michael. His breath hitched. The words blurred for a moment, and he blinked hard. He sat on the edge of the bed, note still open in his hand. His shoulders sank under a weight heavier than work had ever put on him. What had he been so afraid of? Why had it been easier to break the heart of the woman he loved than to confront the ghosts of his past? He heard his father's voice stern, tired, defeated as if it came through the walls. If you don't hold it together, son, everything falls apart. He'd carried that sentence like a survival rule. Ignoring the truth beneath it, his father hadn't lost everything because he let go. His father lost because he tried to carry the world alone. Michael pressed his palm to his eyes. A tremor ran through his chest, quiet but deeply rooted. Had he become the very man he swore he would never be? The apartment hummed in low silence. Outside, the wind pressed against the glass, soft but insistent. He placed the note back carefully, almost reverently, as if afraid it might break. The drawer slid shut with a muted click that seemed to echo louder than anything he had heard all day. He stood slowly, moving toward the window. The city lights scattered below him like pieces of a life he hadn't figured out how to hold together. His reflection stared back, tired, hollow, older than his years. He rested his forehead against the cool glass. What was he doing? Was he going to let her slip away because he couldn't face himself? Somewhere deep inside, a quiet resolve flickered, small, unsteady, but unmistakably there. He wasn't ready to name it. Not yet. But he could feel it forming like the first heartbeat of a decision that might change everything. Lauren didn't knock. She just walked in, coat dripping, eyes furious. The door hit the wall behind her with a blunt thud that made Michael look up from the papers scattered across his desk. He froze, the pen still between his fingers, mid-sentence, mid-breath. "Where have you been?" she demanded, water pooling onto the hardwood floor beneath her boots. "I've been calling all day." He blinked, confused and tired. He had lost track of hours again. "I was working." "Lauren? What's your becoming dad?" The words landed with a violence that didn't need volume. They cut through the room, through the quiet hum of the heating system, through the shield he'd built around himself for years. He felt them before he understood them, like a bruise touched too soon. He leaned back slowly, his breath unsteady. "Don't say that," he murmured, the sound barely above a whisper. "No," she said, stepping closer, her voice shaking with anger and something far more fragile. "I will. Because someone has to. You're pushing away the only woman who's ever made you look alive. You're throwing yourself into work like it's a lifeboat, but you're drowning. Michael. Don't you see it? You are turning into him." He shut his eyes for a moment, the image of their father flickering behind his eyelids the late nights, the long silences, the tired excuses, the empty promises, the slow unraveling of a man who couldn't love anyone without fearing he'd fail them. "I'm not him," Michael said quietly, though even he could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Lauren let out a trembling breath. "Then stop acting like him." Her coat dripped onto the floor, dark puddles forming around her boots. She watched him for a long moment, her expression fierce. Yes, but threaded with pain. "Vana is hurting," she said, softer now, "and you're pretending it's not your fault, but it is." "Michael? It is." Something inside him recoiled. Another thing cracked. He swallowed hard. "I never meant to hurt her." "I know," she said, "but intentions don't keep a woman warm at night. They don't make her feel chosen." Her voice thickened. "And I've watched you lose too much already." He stood there, unable to form a single defense that sounded true. Lauren's expression softened as she stepped back. "Fix it," she whispered. "Before you can't—" The door clicked as she left, and the apartment fell into a deep, aching quiet, the kind that made him hear things his own breathing, his own heartbeat, the faint ringing inside his ears from the shock of her words. He didn't move for a long time. That night, he tried to sleep, lying flat on his back, staring at the ceiling while the room shifted from darkness to something softer. But the silence pressed against him in waves, dredging up memories he hadn't invited in years. He remembered his mother sitting alone at the dinner table. He remembered homework done in the corner while his father worked late, night after night. He remembered how small he felt, watching the man he admired crumble under the weight of a world he refused to share. He remembered the fear that one day he would be just like him. Now, lying in rumpled sheets, sleepless. He realized that day had already come. The first sunlight crept across the edge of the blanket, a pale stripe stretching toward him. He covered his eyes with his arm, exhaling shakily. The truth was suffocating and liberating all at once. He loved Vana, and he was losing her. Not because she wanted space, but because he'd given her every reason to take it. The thought sent him upright, suddenly restless. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and sat there, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly. His mind raced excuses, regrets, memories, fears all colliding in a swirl that left him breathless. I can't keep doing this. The sentence wasn't spoken aloud, but he felt it as clearly as a spoken vow. He stood, almost too quickly, and walked to his office. Sunlight was spilling across the floor now, hitting the glass-topped desk, illuminating the stack of papers he had planned to tackle. He stared at them, the numbers, the deadlines, the signatures. None of it mattered if he lost her. None of it meant anything if he ended up alone in a life built on fear. His hand hovered over the desk phone for a moment, then he reached for it with a steady, deliberate resolve. "Clear my day," he said when his assistant answered. "Everything. All of it." There was a stunned silence on the other end. "Sir, reschedule, delegate, cancel whatever you have to do. I won't be in today." His voice didn't rise, but something in it had shifted, sharpened. He hung up before she could reply. The office, the emails, the endless meetings for the first time in 20 years. They weren't the priority. He felt the moment settle into him, heavy and terrifying and undeniably real. The clarity he had avoided his entire adult life had finally come. And it asked only one question: what now? He stood there, heart beating too loudly in the quiet room, knowing the next step would change everything if he was brave enough to take it. He stood at her door holding flowers and a letter he rewrote 3 times. The wind pressed at his back, cold enough to seep through the collar of his coat, but he barely felt it. His fingers tightened on the bouquet as he tried to steady his breath. The hallway light cast a soft glow over the cream-colored envelope in his other hand, its edges wrinkled from being opened and closed too many times. He knocked, once, then again, softer. Footsteps approached from the other side. His chest tightened as he listened, every creak in the floorboards sounding louder than it should. When the door opened, Vana stood there in a sweater the color of warm sand, her hair loosely tied back, her expression calm but unreadable. For a moment, he couldn't speak. She looked at the flowers first, then the letter. Not suspicious, not hopeful, just waiting. "Can I talk to you?" he asked, his voice low, careful. She stepped aside without answering, and he walked in. The familiar scent of her apartment wrapping around him like something he had missed longer than he wanted to admit. He set the flowers on the counter and held onto the letter, as if letting go of it meant the courage inside it might disappear. "I wrote this," he said, holding it gently between his fingers, "because I didn't trust myself to get the words right if I said them out loud." She nodded once, arms folded lightly, as though bracing herself. He took a slow breath. "I owe you honesty. I owe you more than that. But this is where I have to start." She didn't interrupt. She never did. "My whole life," he said, his voice roughening, "I've been running from becoming my father. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I achieved enough, I'd outrun his shadows." He paused, the air in the room tightening. "But I chased work the way he chased escape. I justified every absence, every disappointment, every broken promise the same way he did." His hand trembled slightly around the letter. "And the worst part," he whispered, "is that I didn't even realize it until you walked away." Vana's gaze softened, almost imperceptibly, but she still didn't speak. The silence pushed him to continue. "I hurt you," he said, "not because I didn't care, but because I was too afraid to let myself care fully. You deserved presence. You got pieces." His voice cracked. "I'm sorry." He extended the letter to her, swallowing hard. "Everything I don't know how to say is in here." She accepted it gently, her fingertips brushing his, a small contact that made something inside him shudder awake. She unfolded the letter slowly, smoothing the creases with her thumb before reading. He watched her eyes move across the page. He wished he could stop his heart from pounding, wished he could read even a hint of emotion on her face. But she was still, almost too still. In the letter, he had written what he'd never admitted to anyone, not even himself, that he worked because fear ruled him, that love frightened him more than failure, that she was the first person who made him want to live differently, that he wasn't asking for forgiveness, only a chance to show change with time, not promises. When she finished, she folded the letter with care, not haste, not frustration. "You rewrote this," she said quietly. "3 times," he admitted. "Why?" "Because I kept telling the truth halfway," he said, voice low, "and halfway isn't enough anymore." She looked down, her fingers pressing gently against the fold of the paper. "Michael, words are easy. I know," he said quickly. "That's why I'm not asking for your trust today, or tomorrow. I'm asking for the chance to earn it, to show up, to be here. Not with money, not with excuses." His voice softened. "With time." She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in slowly. When she opened them again, there was something raw there, pain, memory, a lingering hope she'd tried so hard to suppress. He stepped back, giving her space. "If you don't want that," he said, "I'll respect it. But I needed to tell you who I am, and who I'm trying to be." A long silence stretched between them. Not cold, not warm, just fragile. Vana looked at him fully then, really looked, and he felt it like a weight lifting and settling all at once. She walked toward him with small, deliberate steps, her expression unreadable, but her presence unmistakably steady. She stopped just inches away, holding the letter against her chest. "Michael," she said softly, "I don't need perfect. I never did. I need real." He breathed out shakily. "I'm trying. I know," she whispered. She looked at him for another long breath, then turned and walked toward the doorway leading deeper into her home. She paused there, hand resting lightly on the frame. "Come in," she said, not an invitation to celebrate, not forgiveness, not a promise that everything was fixed, just a door open one he had never earned before. He took a step forward, his heart hammering, then another, crossing the threshold into the warm light of her living room, unsure what waited on the other side, but desperate finally to learn. What would proving it look like now? Change didn't happen in one grand moment, but in 100 small ones. That truth settled into Michael's life slowly, like morning light spreading across a room before anyone is fully awake. He felt it first in the soft discipline of leaving the office at a decent hour, then in the quiet ritual of locking his phone inside the drawer of his desk before heading home. Not forever, just for the evening. Just long enough to give the night back to its rightful place. He left at 7 p.m. The first time with his heart pounding harder than it should have. The elevator ride down felt almost illicit, like he was breaking a rule carved into him years before. But when he walked through Vana's door and saw her look up from the stove with gentle surprise, something inside him eased. "You're early," she said with a smile that spread slowly, like she didn't want to hope too fast. "I said I'd be here," he answered, and he was. They cooked together that night, simple pasta, nothing remarkable. But he found himself drawn to the way her elbow brushed his arm when they reached for the same utensil, the way she hummed absent-mindedly when stirring the sauce, the way warmth felt in a home that wasn't filled with deadlines and numbers. Cleaning afterward became its own quiet ritual. He washed, she dried. Their movements were unhurried, comfortable. Once, their hands touched under the warm suds, and the small contact lingered longer than either intended. He felt something settle in him, then something he'd been chasing without knowing it. Over the next weeks, boundaries began to take shape like stones laid carefully along a path. He declined late-night meetings unless absolutely necessary. He scheduled fewer back-to-back calls. He stopped checking emails at midnight. None of it came naturally. Old habits tugged at him like invisible threads. Whenever stress rose, whenever a deal wobbled or a forecast dipped, his first instinct was always the same: work harder, work longer, outrun the problem. It took effort to resist the pull. One Thursday evening, he came home tense, shoulders stiff, jaw tight. Vana noticed immediately, setting aside the book she'd been reading on the couch. "Rough day?" she asked. He nodded, dropping his keys into the bowl by the door. A deal might fall through. "Do you want to talk about it?" He hesitated. Talking wasn't his default. Bearing weight silently, that was the Reeves tradition. But he forced a breath. "It's complicated and frustrating." "Sit," she said softly. "Tell me what you need." And he did, haltingly, imperfectly, but honestly. She listened without interrupting, without trying to fix anything, and the simple act of being heard eased him in a way he hadn't realized he needed. Later, they took a slow walk around the neighborhood, hands brushing occasionally, but not holding. The evening air smelled faintly of pine and distant fireplaces. He felt his thoughts settle as their steps fell into rhythm. Trust regrew the way dawn brightens the horizon quietly. Then, all at once, still. Fear lingered like a faint shadow behind him. He worried he would slip again. He worried that work would pull him back with the same relentless grip it always had. Sometimes, while washing his face before bed, he caught his reflection and saw traces of his father's restlessness, his inability to sit still, his tightening jaw. But then he'd hear Vana move in the next room, her footsteps soft, her voice humming along to a song on the radio, and the fear loosened. One night, the real test arrived. He was at home with her, chopping vegetables for dinner, when his phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen out of reflex. The name flashing there belonged to one of his top executives, the kind who only called when something urgent or catastrophic was happening. He wiped his hands on a towel and reached for the phone, but before he could tap it, he saw his reflection in the dark screen, the tension in his brow, the familiar fear creeping in, the old instinct urging him back into the cycle that had nearly cost him everything. In the corner of his eye, he sensed Vana watching quietly, not expectantly, not with judgment. Just watching, waiting to see who he chose to be. He stared at the screen, his thumb hovering. Then he pressed the button that turned the phone face down, silencing it completely. A breath escaped him, shaky, but real. Vanna's eyes softened. "Are you sure?" she asked gently. "Not even remotely," he said with a rueful smile. "But I'm trying to be." She stepped closer, brushing her fingers along his arm. "That counts." He nodded, feeling something settle deeper inside him, something firmer than fear, something steadier than instinct. They finished cooking in a gentle quiet. He burned the first batch of garlic, and she teased him until he laughed hard enough to lean against the counter for balance. When they sat down to eat, he felt present in a way he hadn't felt in years. Later, after the dishes were washed and stacked to dry, they moved to the couch. Vana tucked her legs beneath her, leaning against the armrest while he sat beside her, their knees almost touching. The phone remained silent on the kitchen counter. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would look like. He wasn't sure how long he could keep every boundary firm, or how often fear might try to pull him backward. But tonight, he knew one thing. He had chosen her, and he wanted to keep choosing her. As he looked at Vana, her face lit by the soft glow of the lamp, a question stirred quietly inside him, one he wasn't ready to speak aloud yet. Was he ready for the next step? The thought hovered, warm and terrifying, as he leaned back against the cushions, wondering how much more he was capable of giving and how much more he wanted to. Under warm string lights, he took her hand like it was something delicate. The late summer air held the gentle stillness right before twilight surrendered to night, and the garden behind Lauren's house glowed softly beneath the layered canopy of light. Michael felt every small tremor in his fingers as he guided Vana toward the center of the lawn. Family voices hushed behind them, curiosity folding quietly into the moment. Vana looked up at him, puzzled but smiling. "What's going on?" she asked softly. He couldn't answer right away. His throat tightened with a mixture of awe and fear, though the fear was different now, softened by the months they'd spent learning each other's rhythms. Tonight, it no longer had claws. Instead, gratitude filled the space where fear had once lived. He took a slow breath, letting the memory of all those small changes steady him, the dinners together, the late walks, the mornings spent beneath the same warm light, and the discipline of choosing time, not out of pressure, but devotion. "Just stay with me," he murmured. The lights above them swayed gently in the warm breeze, casting threads of gold on her hair. He reached into his pocket, fingers grazing the cool metal of the ring box he'd carried for weeks, waiting for the moment that felt like truth rather than performance. And this quiet evening, surrounded by the people who had watched him fall and rise, felt like truth. "Vana," he began, his voice rougher than he intended. "I spent years believing I had to run, that if I ever stopped, everything would collapse." Her eyes softened with recognition. She knew that version of him. She had held his hand when he first tried to walk differently. "But then you showed up," he continued, not asking for anything except time. "And I realized the thing I feared most slowing down was the one thing that made life feel real again." Her breath caught, just loud enough for him to hear. He dropped to one knee. Gasps rose from behind them, Lauren's unmistakably loud one followed by a quick shushing. Probably from their mother, but he barely registered the sounds. His entire world had narrowed to the woman standing in front of him, her hand trembling in his. He opened the small velvet box, revealing a ring simple enough to match her quiet elegance, a round-cut diamond held by a slender gold band, glowing softly under the lights. "Vana Godfrey," he said, the words steady now. "Will you marry me?" Tears gathered in her eyes before she could speak. She pressed her free hand to her lips, exhaling a shaky laugh, as though she couldn't believe such joy could arrive in such a gentle way. "Yes," she whispered, then repeated more firmly, "Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and when he stood, she wrapped her arms around him, holding on with a depth that made his chest ache in the best possible way. Applause broke behind them, scattered but heartfelt. Lauren wiped her cheeks in dramatic circles. Their mother dabbed delicately at her eyes. Even the neighbors along the fence seemed moved, smiling softly at the unfolding scene. Later that night, after the candles had burned low and the dinner plates had been cleared, Michael and Vana sat beneath the archway of string lights, talking quietly about the future where they might marry, how they imagined blending their routines into something new. He rested his hand on hers, noticing how natural it felt, how unforced. Months passed in a blur of planning, ordinary days, and a steady calm he'd never known. They married in a small ceremony in the same garden, exchanging vows under golden light. Michael remembered every word she spoke, promises built not on perfection, but on presence. And then, almost a year later, came the moment that changed everything once more. The sunroom was filled with late afternoon brightness, warm and mellow, settling gently over the soft blankets piled around Vanna's arms. She was cradling their newborn daughter, her tiny fingers curling and uncurling against her mother's chest. Michael stood beside them, one hand resting lightly on Vanna's shoulder, the other hovering near the baby's back as though afraid to disturb something sacred. His phone sat on the table across the room, face down, silent, forgotten. He hadn't turned it on all day. "She looks like you," he murmured. Vana laughed softly, though tiredness edged her voice. "I think she looks like both of us." He leaned closer, studying the small face with an awe that felt almost holy. The rise and fall of her tiny breaths, the faint way her lips puckered as she settled against her mother, the near translucent softness of her dark lashes. Golden light fell across her cheek, warming her skin into a glow that made Michael inhale sharply. He looked away for a moment, overwhelmed by the simple truth pressing against him. This quiet, fragile moment was worth everything he had changed. Vanna glanced up at him, her expression soft and knowing. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "I'm better than okay." Her thumb traced small circles on the baby's blanket. Then she whispered, almost shyly, "Thank you for choosing time." He swallowed hard. Those words hit deeper than any celebration, deeper than vows spoken in front of family. They were a recognition of everything he'd fought inside himself, everything he'd surrendered, and everything he'd gained. He lowered himself onto the couch beside her, touching his daughter's tiny hand with the tip of his finger. She startled slightly, then wrapped her fist around him, a grip impossibly small, impossibly strong. In that quiet room, surrounded by warm light and the soft sighs of new life, Michael felt a peace he had never known. And as he gazed at his daughter, a question rose in him, gentle, reflective, the kind that lingers long after the moment fades. What would our lives look like if we all learned to slow down for the people we love? The thought drifted through him like a breath of wind through the garden, where everything began a question without a clear answer, but one he hoped he'd spend the rest of his life exploring. Sometimes, healing begins where we least expect it, often in the quiet moments when we finally stop running from ourselves. This story reminds us that love rarely asks for grand gestures. It asks for presence, for choosing someone not with promises or perfect timing, but with the courage to show up even when we're afraid. Many of us carry old wounds, failures we can't forget, fears we inherited without meaning to, and sometimes those wounds whisper that we don't deserve softness, or that slowing down will make everything fall apart. But life has a way of proving the opposite. When we risk letting someone in, even just a little, something shifts. The world feels less heavy, the silence becomes less sharp, and we realize that time, simple, ordinary time shared with someone we care about, has more healing power than anything else we can offer. If you're carrying your own quiet ache tonight, I hope you remember this. It's never too late to choose differently, never too late to soften, never too late to give the people you love the one gift they have wanted all along: your presence. Thank you, truly, for spending a little of your time with this story. Your presence here means more than you know. If the journey touched you in any way, a simple share or subscribe helps us keep spreading gentle human stories into the world. Small acts of kindness traveling farther than we ever expect. Wishing you a quiet, warm evening and a heart that feels held.